and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Monday. Tonight, Prime Minister Mark Carney heads to Washington.
Surely he's not just going for a photo op and to make more excuses.
The conversation will center on trade issues and what we want to do to protect Canadian industries.
The Prime Minister is on his way right now to D.C. to sit down with Donald Trump. Will he come home with anything to show for it? We're going to talk to two ambassadors from Trump's first term. David McNaughton and Kelly Craft will be here together in moments. Then, Alberta versus BC.
We're not going to be a G7 leader, and we're not going to be an energy superpower without the federal government making some decisions to build things again.
Alberta's premier is in Ottawa, pushing hard for a pipeline that BC's premier so far soundly rejects. How should the federal government manage the provincial impasse? Our front bench with Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie will be here to talk about that coming up. Plus, falling for fall budgets.
I would say budget in the fall is pretty much the norm as opposed to the exception in the G7.
Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne announces next month's budget will be the start of a new normal for the federal government. We're going to bring you the latest reaction to that a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
He's going to ask about tariffs because a lot of companies from Canada are moving into the United States. You know, everybody's moving back into the U.S., and he's probably going to be asking about tariffs. They're losing a lot of companies in Canada. They're coming into they left here 20 years ago when presidents that sat right at this desk weren't doing their job properly.
That is U.S. President Donald Trump just moments ago indicating that he expects Prime Minister Carney at their meeting taking place tomorrow in the Oval Office to bring up the issue of tariffs, but not indicating what the president plans to do about those tariffs. Let me show you a look at the Ottawa airport just moments ago. The Prime Minister and his entourage, including Ministers LeBlanc, Anand, and Jolie, taking off for D.C. This will be the Prime Minister's second trip to Washington. There's one of his ministers right there. Since the Prime Minister was elected at the end of April, the Prime Minister also getting some advice ahead of this high-stakes trip. Take a listen.
We have more critical minerals than anywhere in the entire world. That our greatest friends and allies south of the border need. That's what I want to come out of the conversation. I don't want the Prime Minister in there getting bullied and telling them you're doing this, you're doing that. It's not going to work.
Instead of coming in and trying to bully the Prime Minister, actually sit down and work to hammer out a deal that lifts everyone up. This is not a zero-sum game.
The guy is always surprise everybody. So we hope it's a good surprise, but I don't want to raise the expectation too high.
With me now to talk about that are two former ambassadors who served during Donald Trump's first term. Former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft, is here, as is former Canadian Ambassador to the U.S., David McNaughton. Hello to both of you. It's a great pleasure to see you together again on our airwaves. I appreciate you making the time. Mr. McNaughton, I will start with you, just sort of on the stakes as you see them of this meeting, given how little movement there has been really over the past few months and how much we know is at stake for Canada in this trading relationship. How much of a risk do you think this meeting is?
Well, look, I think it's always useful and important for the Prime Minister to get together with the President. I think we should be realistic about what the outcome is going to be, although you never know. The President may, he can come up with ideas about deals faster than almost anybody, so you never know. But I think it's worthwhile for the two of them to get together. I know they've been in touch, but I think we should, have a realistic expectation about what the outcome's going to be. I think it's going to take time.
Ambassador Craft, I wanted to ask you, as someone who does know Mr. Trump, President Trump, very well, how important the face-to-face meetings are, the in-person meetings are. I've heard other politicians talk about sort of getting more done in those than via phone or otherwise. Is that the case as you know it?
Absolutely. I think this is Prime Minister Carney's third meeting with President Trump. And, as he was in his last meeting, he was prepared. And I think that's very important, to always be prepared and to come with a package and to be open-minded. And I think this particular meeting, the burden is on Carney. And I think if you're going to talk about whether it's USMCA or tariffs, he really, I hope, has taken the time to look very carefully at the trade agreements between, Japan, Indonesia, the EU, Vietnam, the UK, other countries, and see what have they done? What have they done to prepare? What have they done? What concessions have they made? And how has this been a successful outcome for them and, of course, for the United States?
What's interesting about those agreements, Mr. McNaughton, is that all those countries came to a deal with the president by agreeing to maintain some sort of base level of tariffs. We are in the position where the free trade agreement that both of you know so well was renegotiated during the first term has covered the bulk of our trade and remains in place for that. There's obviously a review that's about to get started and kind of formally has already kicked off. But there are very punishing sectoral tariffs that are in place right now on steel and aluminum, additional ones on forestry, for example, and the auto sector. Mr. McNaughton, in your view, is the goal for the Carney government to see those reduced, given that CUSMA is still in place to cover the bulk of the rest?
Yeah, I think so. But I think realistically, if you look at, those tariffs are being imposed under Section 232, which says that imports of steel, aluminum, and I guess lumber also are a national security threat to the United States. I think that in order to deal with that, we need to actually have a serious discussion with the president about defense and security, not just about military spending, although that's really important, but also about things like critical minerals, which Canada has lots of. And I know the United States has been exploring taking positions in companies that have got critical minerals. We need to find a way to get our critical minerals to market and hopefully to the United States as quickly as possible. But there's lots to be discussed around defense and security. And I think the quid pro quo for, a meaningful and quick uptick in our spending with the Americans and defense spending is to have the 232 tariffs either removed or substantially reduced. You can't as a Canadian say, okay, we're going to spend a heck of a lot. We're going to spend billions more on defense, a lot of it with American companies, and still have, the Americans saying we're a national security threat. That doesn't add up. So I think there's a lot to be discussed there, and that's where I think the discussion should focus.
It reminds me, Ambassador Kraft, of comments you made actually the last time the three of us were on the program together. I think it was the day after the U.S. election, or in and around that week at least, where you pretty much explicitly tied, I think it was, our relationship really with the president to defense in general, but also defense spending. You said, I can assure you, you'll have no better friend than Donald Trump if you carry your weight. On the defense spending portion of that, certainly there have been meaningful increases or promises of them. We're now going to hit 2% this year, for example. We're waiting for the budget a month from now, but an extra $9 billion has been promised. They've articulated a goal of 5% by 2035, which is a big difference from when we had that conversation back in November. Do you anticipate that does provide for a different discussion tomorrow with the president, and your take on what Mr. McNaughton laid out around Section 232 tariffs in response?
I think it's important to understand that when we have talked about tariffs, we have set, the three different areas from which we are looking at to raise revenue, to encourage our trading partners to give concessions, and to also have a trade agreement. And as a national security interest for the United States, and the president is looking at all three of those, and that's very important. And if you look at the world, they set their hair on fire when we started initiating these tariffs. The sky didn't fall. Actually, what happened were countries like NATO, our defense spending increased. the EU, if you look at the other countries that have come to the table that, I mentioned in the beginning, I think that's important to see that nothing happened negative to these countries. Actually, it has encouraged them, it has strengthened them, and that it has given them respect with the president. And I think that's really important. And Prime Minister Carney, I am certain, understands that he has to come prepared, and he understands that, retaliatory tariffs are not the way. You certainly cannot try to compete with President Trump because you'll lose. So if you look at the other countries, look at how they have managed their trade deals, and to see what the barriers are, whether it's NATO, whether it's the Prime Minister being the first G7 country to recognize Palestinian state. I mean, here we are right in the middle of an agreed Middle East peace plan. I mean, he has rallied the world around this 20-point plan. And to see that Canada is recognizing the Palestinian state, I mean, that to me looks like it's an undermining President Trump's objectives. And tomorrow is the second year anniversary. And if you also look at what's happening at the University of Toronto, having a rally from the martyrs, I mean, I think Prime Minister Carney recognizing the Palestinian state may have also initiated in giving more permission to students and to protest in Canada. So I think that's an area that you need to closely examine. And I'm certain, I don't know what will be brought up in tomorrow's meeting, but I am certain that President Trump is going to be looking at areas such as that would be a barrier to having a fair trade agreement.
Mr. McNaughton, I know there's a lot in there to respond to, and I know the Canadian position would differ from what we heard from Ambassador Kraft, but I think it does point to something that has certainly stuck out to me since President Trump's election, which is the degree to which countries have maybe agreed to things that you wouldn't have anticipated they would to, like a base level of tariffs in order to get some kind of agreement. The degree to which he has not been pushed off of the trade agenda or the tariff agenda that the president has put forward, and that largely what he said they would do for federal coffers, they have done without the massive impacts on the economy that had been predicted, at least not yet. What does that do to the Canadian negotiating position in your view, and how should it inform what the Prime Minister brings to tomorrow's meeting?
Well, look, I think it's important to realize that we have a fair trade agreement. In fact, what we've got is a trade agreement that this President Trump, said was the best trade deal that the United States had ever done. So, let's realize that exists. It's important. It's under review, and we'll have discussions about that. I should also add that, Kelly's talking about, retaliatory tariffs. The other reality is that when the United States put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicle imports, we matched them. And as a result of matching them, the Chinese put huge tariffs on our canola and other products out of Saskatchewan that has caused unbelievable harm and damage. So, this isn't a one-way street. It's a two-way street. There needs to be some dialogue. I understand the issue about the recognition of the Palestinian state. I should add, however, that when President Trump was able to pull that deal together, that Prime Minister Carney was effusive in his praise of what President Trump had done. But I go back to, these tariffs on steel and aluminum are being imposed under 232, which says that it's a national security threat to the United States. I don't believe that. And I believe that what we need to do is to have a dialogue about how we can, and Kelly's right, we have not been pulling our weight, and we need to do more. And we need to do it quickly. It's not promises in 10 years, it's action now. And in the event that we do that, and if we do it, satisfactorily, and there's lots of things. For instance, there's chromite in the Ring of Fire that can help the United States do more stainless steel. So that's hardly a national security threat to the United States of America. So, look, I think there's lots of dialogue to be had. I think there's things that we need to put on the table that we haven't been good about in the past. But in terms of a fair trade deal, we got one. Kelly and I worked hard on it, and as I say, the president said it was the best trade deal ever been done by the United States. So we'll have some discussions over the next 7 or 8 months about whether or not every one of the parties is living up to what they committed to under the trade deal that we negotiated, and there are legitimate views on that. But I think there's lots of room for dialogue and discussion, and I think Canada's relationship with the United States is far different than Germany or Poland or the Netherlands. We share this continent together. We're in a two-way defense deal called NORAD. So I think there's lots to be discussed, and I think there's lots of common ground that can be found if people are prepared to be open-minded and reasonable.
I'll leave it on that note. My thanks to both Ambassador Kraft and Ambassador McNaughton. I want to turn now to some other news out of Parliament Hill. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne came out with a budget preview of sorts today to announce a change to the federal budget cycle. Going forward, he says, his government will release budgets in the fall instead of the spring.
I would say budget in the fall is pretty much the norm as opposed to the exception in the G7. Because it really aligns better with the budget cycle that we see in a number of G7 countries. I think the capital budgeting framework is to provide more clarity, more transparency. It's an additional lens. It's not replacing anything. So we're going to calculate the deficit as it was presented in previous budget.
The minister also testified on the budget before the Finance Committee and faced repeated questions from the opposition on how the Carney government will balance the so-called operational budget, as they've pledged to do, in when.
If you don't mind, Minister, would you answer my question? In what year will it be balanced?
And like I said, I've already responded to this question, but what you're going to see is generational investments to put this country on a path for
the
strongest economy in the G7.
Minister, you may have responded to the question, but you haven't answered it. So I'm asking you, since this is a parliamentary committee, if you would answer the question. In what year will the budget balance?
I've already answered that question. You can ask me as many times as you want, sir, but the answer is going to be very similar to what I've told you before.
Coming up tonight on Power Play, we're going to dig into the political stakes for the Prime Minister ahead of his meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. Our front bench is next. Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. There they are. They're back with me in 2 minutes. Stay right there.
He's going to ask about tariffs because a lot of companies from Canada are moving into the United States. Everybody's moving back into the U.S., and he's probably going to be asking about tariffs. They're losing a lot of companies in Canada. They're coming into they left here. They left here 20 years ago when presidents that sat right at this desk weren't doing their job properly.
Donald Trump, just last hour ahead of Prime Minister Mark Carney's highly anticipated sit-down in the Oval Office tomorrow. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has also penned an open letter to the Prime Minister, writing in part, "We only expect you to keep your promises. If you only return with excuses, broken promises, and photo ops, you will have failed our workers, our businesses, and our country. I'm always happy to help because we all must put Canada ahead of our parties." The letter goes on to say, "Best wishes in Washington, Prime Minister. We are all cheering for a big win for Canada." So what needs to happen to make Prime Minister Mark Carney's second visit to the White House a success? Let's bring in our front bench. With me tonight, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt is here. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. Brian, I'll start with you. We just spoke to Kelly Craft, who was the Trump ambassador during the first term of the U.S. president. And she was very specific about sort of look to what other countries have had to agree to even think about what, Canada might have to do, kind of more, intimating that there's more ground we would have to cede to even arrive at some sort of reduction in the tariffs that do exist right now. What's the implication of that, do you think, for the Carney team?
I think she's Trump's ambassador on that panel as well. I mean, she was pretty firm and frankly, I think a bit ridiculous on some things. I was cringing listening to it. First off, I just want to say the idea that the U.S. can just bully everyone around, it's the largest economy, so can it bully people? Sure, that can happen. But the repercussions of that are important as well, right? The idea that the country that's supposed to be the leader of the free world is bullying everyone, I don't think sets us up very well for geopolitical tensions in the future. But anyways, that's not necessarily what we're all talking about, because we're all focused on the immediacy of the tariffs and sort of the economic implications. So second, for Carney and co going to Washington tomorrow, yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that the backdrop of all of this is the idea that they have been somewhat successful. Some countries have given in, and some countries have given some concessions or made promises of big investments. So that's the backdrop. Now, Canada is a different position because we are their most important trading partner. So we can certainly hurt them a little more if ever we want to stand our ground, and it comes to that, more so than other countries would be able to. So that puts us a little bit in a different position. Also, I'd like to think, I'm not sure it's worth anything nowadays, but I'd like to think that Americans, the public, have a soft spot for Canada for many reasons. We don't have to all go through it in the panel here, but our history and our economic ties and even our family ties, and the list goes on. So look, I think that is the backdrop, though, and I know you asked that question, and frankly, it's something that the Carney team's going to have to be wrestling with as they try to go to Washington tomorrow. Not sure they'll get a direct win out of the Oval Office. I'm not sure anyone ever does coming out of the Oval Office, but hopefully it builds ties, relationships, and the conversation keeps going in a positive direction.
Lisa, Brian's right that it is cringy and ridiculous that the idea that the U.S. could kind of bully everyone into the trading relationship it wants, but that is what's happened. Like, those countries that have arrived at deals with the United States have all agreed to base tariffs that they wouldn't have dreamed of a year ago. Like, Trump has, we don't have the weight of the world behind us. Only China levied any kind of counter tariff that's, commensurate in any fashion. We're the only other country that did. Like, what kind of negotiating position does that leave us in?
Everything that we've tried was wrong, it seems, because we seem to be in a bad position right now. And the Prime Minister going down to see Mr. Trump, it's going to be a difficult after discussion because Mr. Trump will take what he wants from it. He'll say that Mr. Carney is a very nice man and I like Mark, and he'll say all those lovely platitudes, but he's also going to point out once again that Canadian economy is hurting and that he's stealing business from us. And the reason why that is so difficult for us in Canada is it introduces uncertainty into investment in Canada. It's not just the tariffs, Vashi, that are hurting us. It's the fact that other companies are saying, what's next for you guys up there? What else is he going to do to you? And quite frankly, the risk associated with the uncertainty around Canada, we may as well just work with the United States directly. And that's the kind of impact it's having now. It's not just on the tariff industries, it's on everything that you could possibly think about. Just like the announcement today, 25% on medium and heavy duty trucks going into the United States. Tom Mulcair kindly explained to me what that was before we actually came to air. Before that, I didn't even know it was a possibility. So, expect the unexpected, but serious meeting. Trump's going to use it for his own purposes. And he's also going to try to spank us on foreign policy, tomorrow being October 7, which is a very difficult day for a lot of people in this world.
I think to Lisa's point, Tom, right? Like, even you heard in those comments from Trump, they just happened right before we went to air, right? The thing he zeroed in on when it came to tariffs was the impact he says it is having on what Lisa just described, right? That companies are picking up and moving to the United States. It's not true in its entirety, but aspects of companies here, look at the auto sector, for example, are delaying operations that we're going to go ahead here and instead pursuing ones in the United States. What does that tell you about sort of the playing field tomorrow, and how risky is this politically for the Prime Minister, even if he doesn't have another choice but to go, obviously?
Yeah.
Right. And I do think that it shows that the Americans are very good at this game. They might have been a little bit rusty. We weren't always sure what Trump was going to be up to. But the question about those trucks, that zeroes in not just on a Canadian industry. It zeroes on a Canadian industry in Quebec at a very fraught time for the votes of the federal Liberals in Quebec. The PACCAR factory just north of Montreal puts out all of the Peterbilt and the Kenworth trucks. It's a huge employer. These are great jobs. They pay super well. And what Trump was saying was, 20, 30 years ago, they used to build those factories in Canada, and now we're bringing them back. If I were working there, I'd be very afraid of what that meant, because it's true that that factory was built with tons of Quebec government money. It was brought in, and there was a whole tussle with other people that wanted it, and Quebec got it. And it's one of the very few things we have. The auto industry, right across the highway, there used to be a big GM plant. That's long gone. And so Ontario's got pretty well the whole industry. That's basically what's left in Quebec. And Trump zeroed in, without naming it, zeroed in on that idea. Over the weekend, we were so ham-fisted talking about the F-35s. Oh, well, we don't really have to buy them, as if that was the top of our threat list. And the person that we sent out to explain it, a junior minister of defense, had so much trouble getting anything out about the F-35s. If you're going to make a threat and you're going to get to the table with Trump, you better be darn sure that you're going to be able to play right through. I don't think that anybody in Washington cared one bit about what we were saying about the F-35s. We'll see what comes out of this meeting tomorrow, but I like Lisa's point that coming on October 7th, it might give Trump the occasion to talk about what Canada did, which, as far as the Americans were concerned, went against their best interests and those of Israel. I don't think they should overplay their hand, because Trump wants to be seen right now as the peacemaker, and he's still hoping, I guess, to get his Nobel. But for Canada right now, this is a very difficult time, and it's not getting easier. This all has to dovetail with the renegotiation of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade deal, Vashi, and anything that comes out of tomorrow's meeting, I think is going to have a hard time meeting that test.
I started the segment off, Benzie, by talking about that letter from the leader of the federal Conservatives, which kind of speaks to, in more general terms, the pressure here at home, right? The sort of political context here at home. There's what's going to happen there, but also how it plays here. Is it enough if nothing worse happens at the end of this meeting, if there aren't any additional tariffs, or there isn't, some throwing away of CUSMA to some degree? Or does the Prime Minister need to come back and say, I actually am able to reduce, let's say, steel and aluminum tariffs by half or something like that?
He's going to have to show a deliverable at some point, Vashi. I mean, there was a lot of snark in Mr. Poilievre's letter. Understandably, he's leader of the opposition. He lost an election because he didn't see the Trump issue, or his campaign didn't grasp how that was going to play. Carney exploited it successfully. But now Prime Minister Carney has to show Canadians said they trusted him to deal with Donald Trump. They have to see some results at some point. Now, the one thing, Vashi, that Canada has going for it is the U.S. consumer. American consumers are now facing 17.4% average tariffs on goods, according to the Yale Budget Lab, which is a nonpartisan think tank. That means the average U.S. household is spending $2,300 more than they did when Joe Biden was president on the same goods. So that means inflation's hitting. Under Biden, the average tariff was around 2%. So they're at 1935 levels. And that's good for Canada in the sense that there's going to be pressure on Mr. Trump, because it's his voters who are hurting the most. The kind of lower middle class, angry folks who felt that they weren't getting a good deal under Biden, well, they're paying a lot more for those goods and services now. But is it going to be enough to put pressure on Trump that he's going to cut Canada some slack tomorrow? I doubt it, but it's building. Mr. Trump's polling is not great. He's resorting to invading the cities of Chicago and Portland to distract attention from the fact the economy is not doing so great in the United States. So he can say all he wants about how factories are moving back there. That's just, there's a few, but it's not, it's that that success is not being felt by the American consumer.
Okay, I got to leave it on that note. We're going to take a quick commercial break. On the other end of that break, the front bench will be back. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith is in Ottawa as we speak. She just met, as you can see there, with Prime Minister Mark Carney. She's pitching an Alberta-backed pipeline to BC's coast. BC wants none of it, or the Premier wants none of it, I should say. We'll talk about that next.
We're not going to be a G7 leader, and we're not going to be an energy superpower without the federal government making some decisions to build things again. We have to get back to operating the country the way it was intended. We have exclusive areas of provincial jurisdiction. The provinces respect the federal areas of jurisdiction. The federal government doesn't respect ours. And so I think if we could partner on those things to make sure that the federal government is focused on areas where it can and should do well, then the country would operate a lot better.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith in Montreal today as a provincial fight over pipelines continues to burn. Smith is pitching her province to be the initial proponent for a new pipeline from Alberta to the BC coast. And she met with Prime Minister Mark Carney here in Ottawa this afternoon. There they are, before he took off for his trip to Washington. As the Carney government puts together its next phase of major project, the Prime Minister is now in the middle of a new provincial battle between Alberta and BC, with that province's Premier, David Eby, rejecting Smith's position.
Doesn't have First Nations consent, makes no financial or economic sense. It has no private proponent, no route, no private funding, and would cost taxpayers billions. The non-existent Alberta pipeline project would put tens of billions of dollars in real BC projects and jobs at risk. On top of that, it threatens one of the world's most precious and intact ecosystems, our beautiful BC coast and Great Bear Rainforest.
So how should the Prime Minister navigate his way through this provincial impasse? Let's bring back the front bench. Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie are back with us. Tom, I'll start with you on this one. We went through months where premiers collectively were coming out talking about all the things that they had in common, what they wanted to see for the country's economy. This is the first real fight that I've seen in a long time between premiers. And in particular, Premier Eby has very sharp words for Premier Smith. Her rhetoric isn't quite there, but obviously the thing she's pitching, she would know is not going to be entertained by a lot of people who voted for David Eby. How much of a political headache do you think this is for the Prime Minister, especially given the fact that Premier Smith is saying, I want this on the list come November or the Grey Cup when that second tranche of major projects comes out?
Well, I think anyone listening to David Eby's list understands that it's very hard to poke holes in it. It's very solid. And at the same time, Danielle Smith is playing what I would simply call a political game. Last week, she went so far as to say this is basically the end of Canada if we don't get what we want. But what she wants isn't backed by a single private company willing to put up the money to build this thing. The federal government already spent $35 billion of taxpayers' money to build the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the West Coast. And now she says, well, she'd like to see another one. But based on what? Other than the simple desire to say that Canada has to work the way that she wants it to work. It has to work when everybody can get together and find a common cause for a project. Right now, the best thing that we could do would be to look east. There is so much demand in Europe for Canadian energy right now. Having a brand new pipeline to the West Coast doesn't make economic sense. If Carney wants to be taken seriously, he should remember what his energy minister said over the weekend. This is an imaginary project being thought up by Danielle Smith. She's put some private companies around a table to draft something, but none of them is willing to put a penny into such a project because it doesn't exist. So I don't think that Carney should be losing too much sleep over this. I thought it was very classy of him to sit down with Danielle Smith as soon as possible, but I don't think this is going anywhere.
Lisa, what do you think?
I'm on the other side of it from Tom, actually the complete other side. I think that what I heard Premier Eby say was there's no real project here. But in his next breath, he said, but this project is so real, it's going to destroy 10,000 jobs in BC. So I feel that he's just putting out, I think, a very strong statement at the beginning. As to the question as to whether or not there's a proponent, there are a lot of projects in this country that started out as a government idea. I'd point to AECL. I'd point to the oil sands themselves. I mean, sometimes you do start the project off by having a government proponent, and then it transfers over into private ownership at some point in time. And then the last point that I would make is the question of whether or not there's a business case. Now, I would just remind people of the geography of oil shipments in the world. Any oil that's coming out of Houston is actually going to be going through the Gulf of Mexico, America, whatever you want to call it, and it's going to be heading in an easterly direction, or it's got to go through the Panama Canal. Canada has this incredible ability to serve the West through our own ports on the west coast of Canada, and it's quite frankly very competitive with what's happening on the United States. The East is served by Houston already. Therefore, making our play in the West makes a whole lot of sense for a pipeline.
Brian, you've sat around the Premier's table. We've spoken for so many years about how many times the premiers were either speaking out against the federal government or at odds with each other. That has largely been, not the case, at least since the threat from Donald Trump started in an economic sense. Why do you think this issue is different? And do you think it will be a challenge for the Prime Minister to navigate?
So let me just start off with the preamble. I think Carney took the momentum of Trump having everybody get together as Canadians, but then also as political leaders, and there's an impetus to work together. And he added to that and basically said, we're going to build some stuff and we're going to get some of your major projects done. So you could certainly feel, I think, I'm not in the room anymore, but I think you could feel the premiers with a lot of goodwill, hoping that this would be the case. They would always come out, I think, very positively when meeting with Carney, but then also saying, you know, we're saying the right things, we're feeling good about this, kind of always putting a little bit of a caveat on it. And look, these types of political fights, Vashi, you're the one that's the best place to tell us how many have happened over the last few months. You see it every night. But yeah, I mean, we've seen lots of those before the sort of Carney administration has come in. So this isn't abnormal. It's maybe new for the last few months. Look, I want to say, Lisa and Tom, I think make both great points. And if you can believe it, I'm going to be a little in the middle where I think for Carney, he simply needs to say, I mean, this just doesn't fit a major project. Like if you want to put a few $1 million as the province to see if there's a business case, if there's proponents, if other stakeholders are on side that want to be involved, if we want to develop some conditions for this to happen to get to the West Coast, things like that could make sense. But the step into saying this is a major project when there's no proponent, one of the conditions of Bill C5, I had the chance to review it, basically says the likelihood, some version of the likelihood of it happening. Well, if there's no proponent, there's no likelihood. So unless the province says we are the proponent, or they say we're just simply trying to build a business case, I think Carney can kind of say, yeah, look, great that you're thinking about this stuff. Doesn't really fit the major project bill, but you know, go and try to build a business case and get some stakeholders on side.
Yeah, I think he can, Brian's right, Benzie, use it substantively as an out. But politically is a different story, right? Like, I remember at the beginning of all of this, Carney and his ministers kind of getting annoyed whenever the pipeline was brought up, right? As a test point or a litmus test for what do you mean you're going to be different than the previous government? What do you mean these major projects are going to be a different approach to economic development than the previous government took, right? And they would, but the reason they kept getting asked about, which I think I explained even when I interviewed him, was like, it's because that's the flashpoint, right? That is the political flashpoint of the last 10 years between the West and the East, essentially, or Alberta and Saskatchewan and much of the rest of the country. So even though he might substantively be able to say, like, hey, guys, this doesn't fit the bill for what we outlined in C5, I don't know what that does to quell the politics around it.
Yeah, the politics are tricky. And Vashi, you and I were in Saskatchewan and Saskatoon for the First Minister's meeting, where it was significant. It was a significant win for Danielle Smith that the words bitumen pipeline were in the communique at the end of that meeting. She was very happy with that. Carney was happy to make her happy. And I think everyone was sort of, you know, and remember, David Eby wasn't at that meeting. He was in China on a trade mission. But I mean, there's a lot of domestic politics at play. Danielle Smith is playing to an audience in Alberta. She's talking about, a referendum, and there's a secessionist movement there. I think it's overstated, frankly, and I think she's giving it oxygen, and it's probably not a smart thing to do, but she knows Alberta politics better than I do, and she's about getting reelected, not about anything else. David Eby is playing to his domestic audience. Tom's not wrong. This is his voters are opposed to this pipeline, and he's not wrong in saying that it's fictitious, because it is fictitious. Until there's a private sector proponent, it's a pie in the sky idea. And do taxpayers need to spend, as Tom mentioned, $35 billion on another pipeline? We've already given you one pipeline. Do you need another one? It's a tricky play, but it's all about politics. The problem for Carney is, how good is he at being a politician? I'm still not sold on the fact that he's all things to all people right now, but at some point he's going to have to make decisions that are going to be unpopular with some quarters in the country, and that's going to be tricky for him.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, Tom, it's actually what struck me when this whole major projects thing first came out. The idea that provinces kind of had to like submit their projects, right? This idea, like they're going to pick winners and losers among the provinces. Eventually, you had to think that because you've only got a finite number of projects, you're going to have provinces pitted against each other. It just took a while to get there.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said. And I don't think that EB is stretching the truth when he talks about the importance of having First Nations as part of this. Canada is a signatory of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as is British Columbia, the only province. Northwest Territories is also signed on. That means that you have to look at prior informed consent, and it was already tricky to get Trans Mountain through. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was fought tooth and nail by British Columbia. Trudeau pushed it through, right? And it's there. Before any other government's going to go through with this, you'd have to have a much different ecosystem. You'd have a completely different approach economically, socially, environmentally than what we have now. I honestly do believe that Danielle Smith's playing a bit of a game here. Her terminology last week was so strident about the effect on Canada. It's almost as if I don't get what I want, then Canada is breaking apart and it's not worthwhile. You know what? I come from Quebec, and that stuff is stuff that I've heard my whole political career. If Quebec doesn't get what it wants, the place falls apart. Well, I'm sorry. You know, tell you, it's your football, and if you don't get to be the captain, you won't play, fine. Walk away with your football. But at some point, you got to call that bluff. Otherwise, you don't have a country.
I've got 30 seconds each for Lisa and Brian. Lisa, you first.
You know, if we're going to judge every project on that list as something that doesn't have a private proponent, then there's a number of other ones that are very important to, for example, Nova Scotia Wind West, that actually fall off the list as well. So just because it's a fossil fuel thing, let's just say why this is being said. It's because it's fossil fuel. It's not because it doesn't have a proponent. Don't dress it up any more than you have to say it. Just say it's because it's an oil pipeline and certain people don't want to have an oil pipeline, and call it for what it is, because other projects fall off for exactly the same reasoning as has been given by other panel members.
Brian, last word to you.
Can't speak for the Carney government, but I would say that proponent could very well be a government. Like, in my humble opinion, if the Alberta government is saying that they're going to be the proponent of this pipeline, that's legit to then try to go through the major project. But that's not the impression that I had. It sounded like they just wanted to get things started, and they made the argument that there will be a private sector proponent eventually. So to me, there's sort of two different things. The proponent could be just anybody that's willing to fork over the amount of money for the project to move forward. But look, these are Canadian politics. Certainly, we worked on the Energy East pipeline when I was in government, and we accepted that there were other regions of the country that had things to say about a project that would go in their backyard. That's kind of what Canada is.
Okay, we'll leave it on that note. Thanks, guys. Rob Benzie, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Brian Gallant, our front bench. Appreciate the discussion. Coming up, more on Prime Minister Carney's visit to the White House. He's scheduled to meet tomorrow with President Trump. Our Mike LeCouture is traveling alongside the Prime Minister. His report is next.
Tomorrow, the Prime Minister is going to the White House to announce this deal. Surely he's not just going for a photo op and to make more excuses.
The conversation will center on trade issues and what we want to do to protect Canadian industries and Canadian workers, at the same time building an economy in North America that's in the interest of both countries.
Surely after promising to negotiate a win, to have a deal by July the 21st, the Prime Minister's not flying all the way to Washington, D.C. just to have lunch.
There was a leader of the opposition suggesting if the President of the United States invites you to go to Washington for a meeting and a working lunch, we should have just said no and hung the phone up.
Back to our top story. You can hear there pressure on the Prime Minister to deliver on his second White House meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. CTV's senior political correspondent Mike LeCouture is traveling with the Prime Minister. He's been working the phones ahead of that meeting tomorrow. And just before takeoff, we asked Mike if Carney's team is worried this thing could go sideways.
Yeah, Vashi, that's always the concern, and certainly in the back of the minds of Canadian officials as Mark Carney decides that he will go for that meeting inside the Oval Office. I mean, one has to look no further than Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who had that very acrimonious exchange with J.D. Vance and U.S. President Donald Trump just a number of months ago. Now, of course, there was another meeting where things went better, and then, of course, we had that meeting back in May where Carney and Trump did seem to get along quite well. And it was at that meeting as well where Prime Minister Mark Carney tried to quash any talk of a 51st state, even though it has come up once again. Now, we are hearing from Canadian officials that they're cautiously optimistic that there can be some progress in tomorrow's meeting that could pave the way to some relief on steel. And that is something that, of course, that politicians from both sides of the border are hoping will happen. There was a meeting today of premiers and governors from the Great Lakes area, and you heard from Josh Shapiro, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, who had talked about how tariffs on those types of items and on Canadian items as well, but also tariffs writ large are having a huge impact on his economy, negatively impacting it, and he, among other governors, are urging U.S. President Donald Trump to pull back on the tariffs. Now, this is something that, of course, will be one of the goals of the Canadian side to try and go in there. We're also hearing that they're hoping that this will just continue to build on that personal relationship. We know that U.S. President Donald Trump really thinks highly of those types of interpersonal relationships, and it's something that he puts a lot of weight into. The first couple of meetings have gone well, and I speak about that one, the one, of course, at the G7 in Kananaskis as well, and now they're hoping to continue to build on that. But again, despite the calls from opposition leader Pierre Poilievre to come back with a win, it's unclear if that will happen, and certainly the Canadian government and Mark Carney and his team are trying to manage expectations as they head down to D.C. and into the Oval Office again. Vashi?
All right, that's senior political correspondent for CTV News, Mike LeCouture. We're back with more after a short break. Welcome back to Power Play. Our takeaway is, of course, about our top story. Prime Minister Mark Carney is set to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump for the second time in the Oval Office tomorrow. We spoke to former U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Kelly Craft, about that meeting. Here's what she said the Prime Minister has to do.
Prime Minister Carney, I am certain, understands that he has to come prepared, and he understands that, retaliatory tariffs are not the way. You certainly cannot try to compete with President Trump because you'll lose.
The federal government certainly has not signaled that they plan to concede any additional ground to the Trump government, or the Trump administration, rather. We, of course, wait to see. There are some signals that perhaps some of the sectoral tariffs could be reduced or an agreement of sorts reached there, but we'll have to wait and see. I'll leave Power Play there. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your night.